What's going on, guys? Today we got a super interesting video. This one is super crazy because I've never heard it before in my life, and it will explain a lot, guys. It basically says, why were the Irish once hated in America, in the US? Now, I thought that the Irish people were loved in America when they first got there, but apparently that's not true. You know, I thought that the people that first went to the US were people that fled from Europe because of all the persecution. You know, places like Ireland and England, but it wasn't, guys. It was mainly just like British people and a few others on the Mayflower that arrived in Boston. But this video should break down exactly why the Irish people weren't liked in the US when they first came. What was that phrase? It was like, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, something like that. So this one should be crazy to hear, guys. Leave a comment down below, tell me your theory on it, tell me your thoughts on this one, and let's get it.
The Irish immigrants of the 19th century are used today as this perfect example of America's melting pot. A foreign people who, through hardship, eventually became so assimilated they were distinct, patriotic Americans. Yippee! In fact, the Irish assimilated so well, the nationwide hatred they faced when first coming to the US is either entirely forgotten or now seen as so absurd in hindsight. But in the 1850s, it was not absurd. The Irishman was seen as a legitimate threat to the decency of the United States. A foreigner who was sometimes, not figuratively, but literally, viewed as an in-between cross of a man and beast. That drunkenness that makes St. Patrick's Day celebrations famous was once viewed with disgust by most Americans only 150 years ago. And the question I wondered was, why were the Irish so hated? What was the origins of this incredible disgust the Americans had for them?
Yeah.
Why didn't we see the same for other immigrants that came in far larger droves, like Germans or Poles? The origins of this anti-Irish sentiment began in Britain. Seeing as both have always been close neighbors, anti-Irish views have existed in some form since the medieval age. The supposed barbarity of the Irish was even an excuse by
we are barbaric people, guys. The British are too damn posh, man. The British are just, man, too damn posh altogether, man. The Irish, man, we're actually kind of good crack. We're good fun, guys. Unlike other nations, bro. Too serious.
By the Catholic Church to invade the island. In the Topographia Hibernica, written by Gerald of Wales in the 12th century, the view of the Irish wasn't too fond. The Irish are a rude people, subsisting on the produce of their cattle only. This people, then, is truly barbarous, being not only barbarous in their dress, but suffering their hair and beards to grow enormously in an uncouth manner, just like the modern fashion recently introduced. Indeed, all their habits are barbarisms. For
nowadays, if you have a big beard and long hair, it's seen as, like, kind of cool. Whereas back then, obviously, it wasn't seen as good, obviously, right?
Much of the Middle Ages, the Irish were not seen as civilized. Okay. The British perception of Ireland came to view the Irish as a sinful bunch of savages who never really adapted to be pious like the rest of Europe. Many military incursions into Ireland were almost like a medieval version of white man's burden. The Irish didn't know what was good for them, and to rule over them was really for their best interest. They weren't truly Catholic, and the British had to show them the way. Centuries later, in an odd bit of irony, this resentment for the Irish not being Catholic enough flipped over as the Irish were now resented for being Catholic at all.
What?
When Henry VIII split Britain from the Church, the British expected the Irish would follow suit and abandon the Pope. Well, this didn't happen, and during a time when entire wars were fought between Catholics and Protestants, this wasn't something the British would just shake off. Repeated attempts to convert the Irish to Protestantism all failed. The stubbornness
Yeah, so we didn't want to be Protestant, we wanted to be Catholic.
To not see the true light of Protestantism fostered a deep resentment towards the Irish. It manifested itself in many forms to explain why the Irish were so daft and uneducated to follow the Catholic Church and not Protestants. This religious origin slowly evolved as the 19th century came about. The Enlightenment brought on scientific theory, and with that, the pseudoscience of racialism as well. The Irish were viewed as violent, belligerent, and downright stupid, entirely different from the sophistication of the Anglo-Saxon race.
Yeah, but the Anglo-Saxons weren't that much more educated, guys. They were you know, because you're well spoken is a good sign that you're educated, but a lot of times, you know, not always is the case, as we know in history, guys. But I will say this, the Irish Fuel, man, we have good crack. We have the best fun I've ever seen in any cities, guys, or any country I've been to.
So the only explanation was that the Irish were a different race entirely. And in many circles, this perception stuck. Even though the Irish had pale skin and light hair, they were seen as white apes. Something other, while also not. Much of this bigotry really only stayed in Ireland until the potato famine. The famine created a situation where millions of Irish fled, many moving to England and settling the cities as poor immigrants. This really didn't help the perception of them as impoverished and criminal, so by the 19th century, anti-Irish views began to flare up once again. Even though America likes to see itself as independent, it still gets influenced from time to time by Britain, and this Irish hatred was no different. In the 1840s and 50s, there was a dramatic explosion of Irish immigrants into the United States. Many were extremely poor and lived in pretty much squalor. They did the jobs nobody else really wanted, like building canals. In fact, in many parts, entire section of building jobs were only Irishmen. Were the Irish universally hated? No. Yet, at the time, the Irish were not viewed as an equal to the average American, or even to the new immigrants of Germans and Poles. The stereotype of them as a violent and sinful people followed them across the sea. So even if this downright racism against them wasn't as prominent as we imagine, there was still a common disgust with the Irishmen.
Huge smiles,
definitely,
great value.
People definitely didn't see us as equal.
Especially with their interactions with black Americans. Because of their poor status, the Irish lived in the same poor neighborhoods as blacks in American cities. They weren't entirely friendly with each other, but compared to the relationship between whites and blacks at the time, it seemed downright friendly. Irish and blacks in the same clubs, streets, even interracial relationships. To white Americans,
this might explain why I love black American culture. Wow, this is interesting, guys. Yeah, it's very funny, like, actually, the way they talk about it is like the way British people and like Germans and stuff are so different than like than the Irish. Do you know, it's actually kind of crazy, like.
This gave the Irish the association of being dirty. In fact, many simply called the Irish white. To some Americans, blacks were actually higher on the hierarchy than the Irish. To paraphrase one observer of the time, black families at least kept their homes clean. To Americans, not only were the Irish poor and criminal, but worst of all, they were Catholic. In early 19th century America, many considered Catholicism dangerous to the American experiment, entirely foreign. To people whose leader of their church lived in their same town, the idea that these immigrants followed a church thousands of miles away in Italy was entirely alien. It was anti-American and horrific. Conspiracies became quite popular about how the Irish would bring down the American way of life. The Pope and his bishops were preparing to invade the United States and form a new Vatican in Cincinnati. Now, this wasn't a view everybody had, but it was prominent enough to be noteworthy. If the Irishman was stereotyped as the violent, savage Catholic that he was, then how did the Irish ever get rid of that perception of them in the United States? First was the Civil War. When the war began, thousands of Irishmen took up the Union cause against the rebels. To Northerners, the hatred of the rebels and fighting alongside the Irish stripped away the perception that these people were somehow un-American. After the war, anti-Irish sentiment still existed in many places, but not to the extent it was before the war. The stereotype still persisted in the American mind of the Irishman as an irresponsible, sinful people. So there became a collective effort by Irish-American leaders, even prominent bishops, to change the stereotype of the Irish as a drunkard to a responsible, pious American. The Irish themselves began to change their image, arguing that Catholicism was not anti-American, but was just as moral as Protestantism. Catholic schools taught basic morals while still being American. While anti-Catholic forces like the KKK were at their height by the turn of the 20th century, this was only the last vestige before Catholicism was never really seen as anti-American again. Irish-American leaders began influencing elections of leaders in major cities. Because of their union connections due to decades of working in blue-collar jobs, the Irish were able to vote in Irish-friendly politicians. Those politicians recruited new policemen, many of which were prominently Irish. This began the stereotype of the Irish cop. While still a stereotype, it was one for the better. In a few decades, the Irish went from criminal drunkards to being slowly perceived as law-abiding, proud Americans. And by being law-abiding, proud Americans, in many ways that meant going against the next perceived foreigner. To really wrap this up, the best way that the Irish
That kind of makes me happy, actually, guys. I'm actually kind of happy about that.
eventually fit into the idea as a part of America was that another immigrant group simply took its place at the bottom of the totem pole. So today, the plight of the
That's not good, though.
Irishman in America is really just a distant memory. In a century and a half, a stereotype about a people who would bring about the death of the country now became a light-hearted celebration where all Americans pretend that they're not American. This is Cody of Knowledge Hub.
That was unreal, guys. That was epic. That was 10 out of 10. I'll give that a 10 out of 10 score. What I gathered from that, though, and people can argue this in the comments, 1.5 million views, just a little side note there. But what I noticed about that is basically the whole reason the Irish were hated here in America, not here, I'm living in Ireland right now, is because they weren't Protestant, that they were Catholic. So it was just a religion. It was a religion thing, and it was seen that they were untidy and not as educated. But right now, guys, we all know now that Ireland has some of the best universities in the world, some of the best schools in the world. So it is a very educated country, and the country itself, actually, I think I read a statistic before, it's one of the highest educated countries in terms of university degrees in the world. So yeah, completely different than back in 1850. So super interesting to learn about that history. Didn't know about that at all. Leave a comment down below. Tell me what you guys think. I'll see you on the next one, man.